I'm Stephanie Tadamon, and I did a great job of welcoming you and introducing our speaker this evening. So I'm happy to welcome you and thank you for attending this lecture on the emergence and legacy of Palestine Solidarity. And this, as I'll explain in a moment, is the first of two events that we've organized for this week related to the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. So we're really glad that you've especially chosen to come join us since it's apparently a new season outside and really fine weather. But to join us here on the UNB campus. The University of New Brunswick remains on the lands of the Wolastoqiyik. This territory has never been surrendered or ceded and remains Wolastoqiyik land. This region is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which were first signed with the British Crown in the year 1725 by the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. And the treaties did not deal with the surrender of land and resources. They recognized Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And so as we like to remind you here in the Department of Historical Studies, this is not just something for the history books, it relates to ongoing colonial violence and dispossession. So we'll take that moment to express our gratitude for being able to live and meet in this place. I'm especially happy to welcome you on behalf of the organizing committee. So that's myself, along with Fred Burrow, Paul Reffick, Matt Sears, and Angela Tozer. So we're kind of operating as an expanded version of our department's EDI committee, which is very gratefully funded by the Department of Historical Studies and UNB's Faculty of Arts. And moreover, the events this evening and tomorrow are co-sponsored. So by the Department of Historical Studies, the Department of English, and the NB Media Co-op. So we're very grateful for this widespread support. Now, the second event I mentioned for tomorrow evening is going to take place Wednesday, March 11th, this same time, 5 to 7 p.m., and just upstairs in Tilly Hall, room 303. You can find the posters in the hallway. And that event will be a roundtable discussion on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. As a movement, it's a roundtable open to members of the university community, so you're all very welcome. And it's going to be focusing on how BDS works in the university setting. So asking questions about how academics and students have campaigned for BDS in other contexts as well. The speakers for tomorrow's roundtable will be Sarah Durham from UMBSJ, Vikar Hussain, UMB Fredericton, Hassan Mahmoud from the Student Organizing Collective, Sean Marine from St. Thomas University, and Mostafa Henaway, who's our speaker tonight. So please do bring your friends and join us tomorrow. For this evening's talk, we are very pleased to welcome our speaker, Mostafa Henaway. He is an organizer and writer and active in Palestine Solidarity and anti-war movements since 2000. He's been a community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center since 2007, mobilizing for migrant and labor justice. Mostafa has been active in Palestine Solidarity from the International Solidarity Movement on Al-Awda, the Right of Return Coalition, and involved with Tadamon Montreal, which is a solidarity collective that supports struggles for self-determination, equality, and justice across the Middle East, including an end to Israeli apartheid policies and support for the campaign for BDS. Mostafa is also an author and researcher. His book is titled Essential Work, Disposable Workers, Migration, Capitalism, and Class, and it won the Errol Sharp Book Award in 2024, as well as an honorable mention for the Canadian Association of Work and Labor Studies Book Award, also 2024. Mostafa is currently a PhD candidate at Concordia University in Geography, Planning, and Environmental Studies, researching labor conditions inside Amazon's warehouses in Quebec. His talk for us tonight is called The Emergence and Legacy of Palestine Solidarity, Revisiting Quebec's Histories of Anti-Imperialist Struggle in the Face of Ongoing Genocide. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee for the gracious invitation and hosting, and thank you to everyone for being here and for this talk and for this hopefully a collective discussion, because don't want this talk to be simply fossilized in terms of thinking through some of these histories particularly in Quebec, as being beyond us, right? So what are the actual lessons that we can actually stem and distill from previous organizing around Palestine Solidarity and also more contemporary modern history? So in that, because there are general lessons, not only that we can learn, but that very much need to be applied, I think, in our contemporary and current context with the ongoing genocide, but also, you know, not just the ongoing genocide, the current war on Iran and Lebanon, as we're seeing right now in front of our eyes, but also what we can learn in terms of the correlation of forces, right? How do we understand power? How do we understand change? How do we understand the role of movements? And what kind of movements very much stems from movements' worldview, right? It's not simply that we are reacting, but it's very much comes from our perspective, our broader perspectives that we organize, right? And I think this is one of the major lessons sort of out of the Palestine Solidarity movement, because it's not spontaneous, right? And that's also an important element. You know, many people became activated in different periods, watching the ongoing violence, whether it be the genocide, whether it be the Second Intifada, whether it be earlier waves like the 6-Day War, that there are generations of activists who become mobilized, or people who become mobilized in those moments, but the form in which they're mobilized and the actions they take very much stem not from that moment, but from periods of struggle, right? And sort of the broader context they're in. And, you know, we see this today in the kinds of different forms of organizing, whether it be the encampments, whether it be boycott, divestment, and sanctions, whether it be even, I would argue, the confusion around how we understand the current war and its relationship to Palestine. So those histories are really crucial in terms of situating and charting a path for our moment, right? And not just Palestine as a siloed issue, but as part of a bigger and larger worldview and a liberation not just for Palestinians, but also for us, right? And so today, and I kind of changed the talk, so I'm not going to specifically only focus on Quebec. I'm going to focus on different moments in Canada and also some international examples. And I want to start, and specifically I'm starting from the Naqsa, which is the 6-Day War, June 1967, up until the present. So looking at the period of from 1967 up until the end of the 1980s, or the Oslo Accords, and then the Second Intifada from 2000 up until a very shorter period in 2005, because the Palestine Solidarity movement very much shifts in 2005 with the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, up until the Arab Spring, and then our present moment. So the first phase, wanting to talk about, is what takes place in 1967. Why is the 6-Day War so important? And when we think about that radical moment in the late 1960s, we think about May 1968 in Paris. We think about worker struggles or Quebec nationalism and the independence struggle. We think about the anti-war movement in the United States and Students for a Democratic Society, or the Black Panthers and the Black Power struggle, but also the Red Power struggle in the 1960s, and also the Vietnamese liberation struggle. And what happens in Palestine, or to the Palestinian people after 1967, is also a watershed moment, right? Not a watershed moment of defeat. It was a defeat for the Arab states. It was a defeat for Egypt. It was a defeat for Syria. But out of that defeat, out of the 6-Day War, you know, because prior to that, much of the view was that those states, those developmental states, post-colonial states, will liberate Palestine, will liberate the Arab world. They were part of the non-aligned movement, and they were part of this, this state-led sort of anti-colonial project in the global south of the third world. But for the Palestinians, prior to 1967, their struggle had always been sort of embedded within the broader sort of pan-Arab movement, right? And the custodians of the Palestinian struggle had been the Egyptian state, had been Nasser, had been Syria. It was never Palestinians themselves, right? So in 1968, and authors like Abdulrazak Tikriti, who've done much work on this, is that you have a Palestinian revolution. You have a Palestinian revolutionary process that takes place in the defeat of the Arab states, right? And the Naqsa, so the occupation of the West Bank, the occupation of the Gaza Strip, the further displacement of Palestinians. And in that process, Palestinians begin to learn is that we are the masters of our own fate, right? It's only us who can lead the struggle, and it's us that have to develop its strategy, its tactics, and much of that revolutionary process begins to take place away from sort of the urban elite and into the refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, right? And you have the formation of the PLO prior to 1967, but it's really when Fatah and the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, other leftist organizations and parties as well, begin to take over the PLO, that it becomes a revolutionary force, right? Not just in terms of armed resistance, but also grassroots organizing in terms of students, women in the camps, farmers, peasants, and that process is linked to a broader world outlook of anti-imperialism, right? And that anti-imperialism, that Palestinians really saw their struggle against Zionism, against the Israeli state, as part of a broader struggle against US imperialism, right? So the solidarities it created were immense, right? So they saw their struggle in the same vein with the struggle against apartheid South Africa and in solidarity with the African National Congress. They saw their struggle as being linked to the struggle in Vietnam against US imperialism. And so that third world internationalism just wasn't in the third world, right? You saw that process shape here in North America, right? So there was much solidarity with the Black Panther Party, with the Black Power movement. You had actually delegations of the Black Panthers, whether it be to the PLO in Algeria or in Lebanon. You also had, and what fundamentally begins to shape is that you begin to have this emergence, especially in Quebec, right? You have pockets of it in different parts of Canada, but in Quebec, what's happening at the same time is that Quebec nationalism becomes radicalized as well. And it begins to see its process in the 1960s and 1970s with the Quiet Revolution, is that Quebec independence can't take place without dealing with the question of US imperialism. Not just what they believed was Canadian or English Canadian dominance over Quebec, or oppressed Quebecois people, but that, as Michel Chartrand said, our main enemy is Washington, not Ottawa, right? So more and more within the Quebec labor movement, which wasn't dominated by the US labor movement or the international trade unions, and connected to the the International Confederation of Trade Unions, nor was it part of the communists, this during the Cold War. So in Quebec, the popular forces, particularly in the trade union movement, were able to develop and chart their own analysis and framework in allegiances, right? And so in the late 1960s, what actually begins to take place is the forging of a new solidarity where Palestine becomes central to the two wings of the Quebec nationalist movement, and particularly within the trade union movement and with other radical movements. And this takes place really in 1969. And one of the most important moments is that, actually, I'm going to go, yes, so in this photo, so this, I'm going to come back to this picture in a few minutes, but there's a person here. So the person in the middle, who is during the 1970s the president of the Conseil Central, the Montreal Labor Council for CSN at that time, it was called the CNTU, Michel Chartrand, is two people down. This person with the big goatee and the black suit is Razak Faraj. So Razak Faraj is a Palestinian refugee, a first-generation Palestinian refugee who migrates to Quebec and begins to get active around the rights of Palestinian refugees in the 1960s. And he's invited to a conference. And you know, sometimes how these small interactions and these small moments actually lead to much bigger outcomes is pretty remarkable. So in 1969, he gives a conference in the University of Laval, and he meets Michel Chartrand, and he also meets René Lévesque, who then was the president of the Parti Québécois of the University of Laval chapter, and they begin to forge a real relationship, right? And that relationship leads to what was then a week of anti-imperialism organized by the Conseil Central of CSN, right? So talking about Black liberation struggles, what was then the Taxi Liberation Front in Quebec, but also Palestine, Cuba, and it was part of this bigger outlook that Michel Chartrand, who was then part of the Parti Socialiste Quebec, the Quebec Socialist Party, it was vehemently internationalist, anti-imperialist, and his outlook. And after that conference, something big really begins to take place after the formation of the Quebec Palestine Association. So in 1972, Razak Faraj, the Quebec Palestine Association, organized a delegation, a large delegation. Then the president of the Teachers Union of Quebec, the CEQ, the Confédération des Enseignants de Quebec, members of the CSN at the larger national level, people from the Parti Québécois, journalists go to Lebanon. They go to the camps in Lebanon in 1972. They also visit Jordan, Egypt, and Michel Chartrand actually had spent time in the south of Lebanon in the camps with Yasser Arafat, right? I mean, many people can historically look at Yasser Arafat's role in the later part of his life, post-Oslo, but prior to Oslo, much like Nelson Mandela, Yasser Arafat was considered was considered a terrorist, right? The PLO was considered a terrorist organization, and that he was essentially the chair of a terrorist organization. But for the Quebec political and trade union establishment, they had forged a real deep relationship and began to learn about the realities of Palestinian refugees and of Palestine. And in that moment, this is in French. I never translated this quote, but I'll try to summarize it, but I'll read it. This is from Michel Chartrand. Eureka, je trouve le problème, c'est qu'on ne parle pas de Palestiniens dans le monde. On ne parle que des Arabes. Nous on va parler des Palestiniens. on va organiser une conférence internationale sur la solidarité ouvrière. And so in this moment, Eureka, we have to, it's not just about Arabs, but we have to focus on Palestine. And he calls to organize a conference in 1975. And in that conference in 1975, I'll go back to this, is the formation of the Confederation of Workers' International Solidarity, or CISO in French. So, and CISO gets institutionalized later on, and that's a whole other discussion. But in its beginnings was an extremely radical project, an imagination of where people thought and saw, also with its limits and its problematics in terms of their understanding of Quebecois oppression, in terms of it being a colonized people. But the idea that they saw themselves and the dynamism of their movement was in anti-imperialism. It brought together a conference from delegation of over 50 countries from the global south, from Palestine, from Algeria, from Syria, from Cuba, from Chile, to a conference with 22 trade unions in Quebec, right? Calling for Palestine Solidarity, calling for recognition of PLO, calling for an end to the occupation, and actually calling for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And so alongside CISO, the Quebec Palestine Association continued its work. So CSN, and it's hard to think about this now in the contemporary sense, so the CSN paid for staff to work on Palestine, gave them an office. It printed their newspaper called Fedayeen. So Fedayeen in Arabic is sort of like guerrilla, like not like a patriot, but like a partisan, right? And the union would fund 5,000 copies of this journal every month, which is an impressive set of resources going to the movement. And so this really set the stage of why sometimes, in the Canadian context, why do we think of Palestine Solidarity being so much stronger in Quebec than in other places? And that changes over time. Absolutely. And so, and this is one of the resolutions from the Conseil Central CSN. So Palestinian workers are daily being oppressed economically, politically, and militarily by American imperialism and its ally, Israel. And against the imperialist assault, the Palestinian population is actively waging a heroic liberation struggle to regain its homeland and its territory usurped by military aggression in 1967. Right? This is an official union position, right? Which is rare to see now, right? But this is in the 1960s, and that wave of anti-imperialism solidarity, not just from the labor movement, but really from below and from a radicalized diaspora, just doesn't have titanic shifts in Quebec, but sort of beyond, right? And so this is, there's been some documentation and writing about this. This is in Detroit. So it's really sort of the forging of that, particularly Black Palestinian solidarity at that time, is really prominent. So this is one of the first, when we think about BDS, BDS didn't begin in 2000. It does begin, in terms of a structured global movement in 2005, but after 1967, auto workers in Detroit, because of people know in Michigan, there's a large Arab population, particularly from southern Lebanon, also from Yemen, as well as Palestinian. And so these were all members of the United Auto Workers. And at that time, the United Auto Workers' official position was extremely Zionist, and being not only giving money to Israeli charities, but also being given awards. The president of the UAW was actually given an award And so these workers called for a strike, a grassroots, rank and file, wildcat strike at GM and at Ford for divestment. That no longer should the United Auto Workers divest any funds that are tied to the Israeli state or any military production or relationship towards Israel. And the reason why they had the confidence to go on strike, because many of these workers were tied and had relationships with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, Michigan at that time was very much a rank and file Black Power organization. It differed from the Black Panther Party as it had an analysis more towards worker organization and sort of a different understanding of working class because of its, it being rooted in Michigan and Detroit as opposed to sort of an urban poor organizing on the West Coast and where the Black Panther Party was rooted. But you see that too. I mean, this is the Black Panther newspaper. Next towards it, where Arafat is meeting members of the Black Panther Party. And so there was always being part of this solidarity that was forged. And so after the CISO conference, what happens, this is, the CISO newspaper in Quebec. And in 1982, when Israel invades Lebanon, the Teachers Union of Quebec, CSN, and CISO organized a campaign called SOS Liban Palestine, where they asked teachers to donate individually $2 for direct medical aid from all the different SAGEFs, from all the different locals. And it's extremely militant and sort of demonized poster that gets used even in some right-wing circles today. And the campaign was largely successful in terms of the public debate. It was debated in the Assemblée Nationale. And Yves Charbonneau, the president of the teachers union, was vilified as being a supporter of terrorism. And this is a protest in 1983 that also sort of showed the trajectory of the Palestine movement. So Ariel Sharon, who's implicated in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in 1982, the camp in Lebanon and Beirut of thousands of Palestinian refugees, comes for a visit to Montreal in 1983. So there was a counter-protest that was organized by the teachers union, but mainly by, would shock most people today in Quebec, by the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society. So one of the main institutions of Quebec independence and nationalism, which has become mostly a racist, ethno-nationalist institution, was the main organizer of this demonstration in 1983, and this is a picture of the Le Devoir. And so after this moment, while the Palestine Solidarity struggle becomes institutionalized in these trade unions in Quebec, like CSN, or what's now FNEC, the Teachers Union, or the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society, but the struggle and the outlook of anti-imperialism wanes, right? Its influence wanes. There's no longer a struggle against US imperialism and capitalism, particularly the end days of the Cold War, and it becomes much more conservative and sort of sees a kind of a wave that peaked, but sort of resides, right? And sort of, and so in terms of struggle and organizing, in terms of the Palestine Solidarity movement, especially in Quebec, was very much tied to the Quebec left. So it went through the cycles and waves of the Quebec left itself. So in the next period of struggles really begins to take place in the Second Intifada. right? And in the Second Intifada, on September 28th, 2000, Ariel Sharon goes to the compound of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, of the Dome of the Rock, inciting the Second Intifada to take place, or uprising to shake off, which was initially a popular uprising because the anger had been boiling up since the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, right? You have rampant settlement expansion, both in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, from virtually nil to almost 300,000 settlers. You had riddled throughout the occupied territories, and when people began protesting in the Second Intifada inside Palestine, the response was nearly 1,400,000 bullets by the Israeli occupation forces in the first days of protests, right? The amount of violence against what was essentially a non-violent protest by Palestinians protesting settlement expansion, the checkpoints, the suffocation, and lack of any movement after Oslo led to this massive uprising, but to this violent response by the Israeli state. Right? And in the Second Intifada in 2000, the response becomes really diffuse, right? And the response is really fractured. And the Palestine Solidarity movement is very different. And this is where I became more involved, was that what was happening at the same time in 2000 was the global justice movement, or the anti-globalization movement, right? Of the late 1990s, right? And so the framework of the world in 1999, sort of the activism that was taking place, was much more rooted in the disruption of summits by these multilateral elites, such as the World Economic Forum or the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. The organizing strategy was very much grounded in kind of an anti-authoritarian or sort of anarchist politics of horizontal decision-making and a strategic outlook of disrupting power through direct action, right? There's much debates and outlooks, but also with that, a wing of the movement looking towards the inclusion of colonialism, of settler colonialism as being central, the way racism and structural racism is central to the way in which capitalism and power take shape. But in this anti-globalization movement, in this era, also parts of the Palestine Solidarity movement become influenced. Not totally, because in the Second Intifada, I want to say the response becomes actually quite fractured, right? And you have very much different wings of that movement. And so on campuses, particularly, people were responding. People were becoming radicalized in the Second Intifada, right? And so this is a protest in Montreal in 2001 to disrupt the presence of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was speaking just a few days before September 11th, 2001, right? And it become a watershed moment again in Montreal and Quebec because they tear gas inside the university. He's unable to speak. At this time, he's the former prime minister. He's not prime minister. At this moment, it's Ariel Sharon. And so you had this radical student movement with Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights, also with other people who were involved in the anti-globalization movement, and particularly more anti-capitalist, who become active in organizing around Palestine Solidarity after the Benjamin Netanyahu protest. But at this time, much of the response was very much also beyond resisting sort of being in solidarity with what was taking place during the Second Intifada. other moments like Operation Defensive Shield in 2002 in Jenin in the West Bank, where 500 Palestinians were killed. You saw massive protests in a response, but there was no real strategy other than responding through these protests, right? At this time, it's very much a new energy and a new sort of cycle of struggle and solidarity, but there wasn't really a strategy outside of trying to educate the public on Palestine and sort of to protest the ongoing massacres, right? And then the movement also becomes fractured along political lines, because what happens after Oslo is you don't have a unified Palestinian leadership, you have an institutionalized Palestinian leadership, you have one that's very much becomes NGOized, right, throughout the 1990s. And so much of the language becomes around peace, right? Peace initiatives, normalization initiatives, right? Not about ending Israeli colonialism, right? And particularly, the line gets drawn around the occupation. So for many Palestinians who make up the majority of the Palestinian population are refugees, right? And the central demand has always been the right of return, right? But there was no discussion at that time in the movement on the right of return. So Palestinians begin to organize around this demand and around the Al-Awda, and I've become involved with Al-Awda in Toronto at that time on the right of return campaign, right? So 70% of the entire Palestinian population are refugees. Even when we think about Gaza today, the overwhelming majority of population of Gaza are refugees from surrounding areas in occupied Palestine. So Al-Awda tried to do education focusing on the plight of Palestinian refugees and the right of return, and going back to this question of fragmented solidarities and different trajectories of the movement. One that was very much closely associated with the global justice movement and the anti-globalization movement had been the international solidarity movement. And some of those people are very much involved. Actually, the flotillas that you now see are very much comes from this part of the solidarity movement. So the international solidarity movement begins with the premise that that we're going to organize like we did in the anti-globalization movement, very much focused on disruption, nonviolent civil disobedience, direct action, both by Palestinians and by internationals inside Palestine, right? That people from the West had an inherent privilege at that time because of their passports, because they're white, that they could support nonviolent Palestinian resistance inside the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so it galvanizes a lot of people who are involved in the globalization movement to go to Palestine to do this kind of organizing with major critiques. Also, I won't get into it now, there's not enough time, but I had also I'd spent 6 months in Jenin, also with International Solidarity Movement in 2003 after Operation Defensive Shield, and was witnessing the beginning of the building of the wall, the apartheid wall in the West Bank. So it was critical because a lot of activists began to actually see the realities that Palestinians were facing at that time, but also had limits. The privilege had limits, right? So as a strategy, it also began to really come up against the constraints of that privilege. So on the right, this is a picture of Rachel Corrie. Maybe people know of her story or don't. She was an activist from the United States who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer on March 16th, 2003. And really she was the second person to be killed who was with the International Solidarity Movement, right? So in terms of the limits and the tragedy was that Israel was willing to kill everyone, right? Like there was no difference whether you had an American passport or you had no passport because you were Palestinian. that the occupation force dealt with everyone equally at that time. And unfortunately, one of the things, getting low, but sort of the legacy within that time period, especially in the Second Intifada, which I think affects us the most, and this is not really the arc of the discussion tonight, but it's really worth mentioning because I think we live with its consequences, is that when the US invaded Iraq, a lot of the organizing, and there's a very good article by Arun Gupta, who's a independent media activist, journalist, but also writes for the Socialist Register time to time, who wrote about the arc of Palestine Solidarity in the United States, is that in 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, was very much led not by sort of anarchist movements or people influenced by anarchism as their outlook, but much more, sort of the Marxist left in North America and Western Europe, wanted to build a broad movement, which I did at that time, right? Those demonstrations in up until 2023 were some of the largest anti-war demonstrations, whether it be in Montreal, over 100,000 people, or in London, it was close to 1 million or 300,000. But the fundamental issue for many of the people in the Palestine Solidarity movement was there was no discussion of Palestine. How can you talk about the invasion of Iraq without discussing the question of Palestine, right? And they very much wanted to have this narrow view that we were simply going to say no to war, right? That was the extent of our politics, of the political outlook. And anyone who challenged that within the movement was banished from the movement, right? And so you had the largest demonstrations talking about, it's actually out of fashion now to say Middle East, but so they're talking about, West Asia, North Africa, the Arab-speaking world, and to not center Palestine in the equation of why U.S. was invading Iraq was absurd, right? Because even the U.S. state was talking about it, right? The U.S. state, Saddam Hussein had showed solidarity with the PLO. Iraq was a threat to Israel. So there was always constantly discussion. There was always a link, but the movement refused to because it was too difficult, right? It was too difficult. To talk about Israel was too difficult, right? And so it had to be left to the side. And I think we live with those consequences because if in such a mass movement, if there had been the discussions of Palestine 20 years ago, the level of consciousness in our societies would have been much higher, and maybe the possibilities for what the Israeli state is doing now would have been much more limited. So it's very much noting when we don't do something has real world ramifications. Because at that time, to a certain degree, whether it's symbolic or not, we stopped Canada's participation. I mean, we participated in the war in Afghanistan, we sent troops, but in terms of outright political support to the war in Iraq or the occupation of Iraq was opposed because of the movement. And so I want to go now to BDS and sort of the anti-apartheid movement, which was very much involved in. So all the fragmentation in terms of the analysis of Palestinian refugees, of also just simply an anti-occupation analysis, those divisions and fractures within the Solidarity movement, but also within Palestine, the lack of a unified leadership. Those lessons begin to percolate in different ways and in different quarters, right? So in 2001 in Durban, you have a conference, the UN Conference on Racism, which also held a discussion on Zionism as being a form of racism, is the first time in a while, in many years, actually since the late 1960s, that you have this discussion of reframing Israeli colonialism and occupation as being akin to apartheid, being akin to South African apartheid. And in 2004, you have the formation of the Palestinian Academic and Boycott Cultural, the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott Initiative that forms in 2004 and is the first Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And at the same time, I was very much part of this process. In Toronto, we have the first Israeli apartheid week in 2004. The poster it's actually Austin's posters, but so this is the first Israeli apartheid week, the first one on the left, and it was organized by then what was the Arab Student Collective, supported by Al-Awda, but also supported by Samud, which was a Palestinian prisoner solidarity campaign in Toronto. And what made the first Israeli apartheid week so critical was that it brought out the analysis of Israel being an apartheid state, first and foremost, not so much the language of BDS. Two, it brought out a language of intersectionality of struggles in a way we didn't see during the sort of the Second Intifada, a lot of the campaigns in the Second Intifada. So you can't really see because it's too small. So most of the lectures that we organized focused on local struggles, right? So replacing Palestine within a local organizing context, right? So we had speakers from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty talking about the struggles of housing in Toronto, to the struggles against home demolition in Palestine. We had discussions on migrant justice, then which was known as illegal, centering the right of return to the right to stay, or the freedom of movement and the freedom to stay. And of course, Ilan Pape was the first main speaker, but very much was centered on building local connections and also with indigenous struggles, which was then also very challenging as well. It was a very different context, right? That we couldn't talk about colonialism here. So Palestine actually allowed us to talk about colonialism here at a time when it was very difficult for movements to do so and was considered extremely radical, right? So it was very important. And it went from this one campus, this ragtag operation, we were like at some coffee shop, like 2 a.m. We made a refugee camp, we put it up in the middle of U of T, it gets taken down. And it was a very ragtag operation, but it had inspired a movement again where Israeli apartheid reached over 200 cities and campuses at its peak. And it's from this moment afterwards, this is an older poster linking the Palestinian struggle to South African apartheid. In 2005, you actually have a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And it does two things. It legitimizes the movement in terms of creating a new strategy around Palestine Solidarity, a new language of struggle, right? It unifies all of the demands around the right of return, full equality for Palestinians living inside the state of Israel, an ending to the occupation, and dismantling the wall. So it never discussed, and one of the pitfalls in the movement prior, and I forgot to mention this, was actually always the question of one state or two state, right? This was always a divisive discussion, right? Well, you want one state, if there's one state, what's gonna happen to all the Israelis? They're gonna be forced out. And we're saying, no, this is about equality and justice for everyone on the land. Similar to that of the BDS movement around South African apartheid, one person, one vote. It was about full equality, right? And these demands were about presenting not a one state or two state solution, but full equality, right? If any Jewish person has the right to Al-Awda, then any Palestinian has the right of return, right? If all Israelis live under Israeli civil law, regardless if they're in an illegal settlement in the West Bank or they're within 1948 Palestine. For Palestinians who live in the West Bank, live under Israeli military law. So by ending the occupation, you give full equality and legal rights to those Palestinians. It's not a question of one state or two state, and also the question of Palestinian leadership. So this call is endorsed by 170 Palestinian organizations. And as you know, authors Abi Bakken and Abu Lahan contend the achievement of a unified response among Palestinian organizations challenged divisions that had developed, particularly since Oslo, and pointed to a strategy of nonviolence and international solidarity inspired by successful transition from apartheid South Africa. And the BDS movement at its beginnings was extremely successful, and I think laid a groundwork for some of the successes we see now in terms and the strengths of our movement. So the fact that we're having this discussion, even here on a campus now, might not have been conceivable 15 years ago. It would have been canceled, a lot of things would have happened. In 2006, QB Ontario, the Canadian Union, Public Employees Union, largest public sector union in Ontario, endorsed the call for BDS. Did the first sort of consumer boycott campaign in Canada, called for by the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, around Chapels Indigo and its owners' support for the Israeli Old Soldier Fund. And then you begin to have real serious student campaigns like that at Carleton University in 2010, called for by the Students Against Israeli Apartheid, calling for divestment, right? So it moves away from an individual boycott to an institutional boycott and divestment strategy and sanctions strategy. In the early 2010, people should go on this website just to feel inspired when they can. So it's sort of a drag, and this is by a group called Visualizing Palestine, and it's sort of the growth of the movement of BDS. So from the call, the beginning spot, to 2025, and how many groups, famous individuals, institutions, either divested, respecting the boycott call, grows exponentially. You can go through literally all of it. It's all documented on this website, and it's quite an impressive feat and also data collection on its own. And so the BDS movement really, it's growing and growing and growing. You have groups on campuses. You have the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid. You have the BDS campaign in Quebec. You have a major conference in 2010. But what begins to change the dynamics is not just that people burned out or that people had moved on, was that real divisions begin. This is not about George Floyd, but this is in the Arab Spring in 2011 and 2012, especially what takes place in Syria, creates massive divisions within the Arab left, within the left in general, right? Especially with Libya and Syria in particular, those supporting sort of those grassroots revolutions and the legitimate demands and appeals of the people of those societies, or that those movements and those revolutions were simply sort of colored revolutions, CIA sponsored, led to real divisions within the movement. But it led to divisions that are sort of are much bigger, because it wasn't just about the Arab Spring, but it's about how do we liberate Palestine? How do we liberate ourselves? Right? So is it about sort of these authoritarian regimes that seem to be countering US imperialism, like Russia, like Putin, like Bashar al-Assad? Or is it people's energies and collective capacity from below that's really going to create change? So it is about something much more fundamental, but sort of usurps all the energy from Palestine Solidarity after 2014, right up until October 7th, 2023, with a very interesting moment in 2020 when George Floyd is killed, and you have the massive uprisings in the US, also Black Lives Matter movement here in Canada, This is actually a painting of George Floyd in Palestine on the apartheid wall in the West Bank. Right, the Palestinians begin to express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and vice versa. And so I just want to say some things about right now, and then I'm going to wrap up. So, after October 7th, 2023, we have this massive energy. People come out in unprecedented numbers, in unprecedented ways, to show solidarity with Palestine and with what was taking place to Palestinians. It took some time for people to get over to sort of get past the confusion, what was taking place. The first demonstrations were actually quite small in response, but when it was clear what was taking place was a genocide, you begin to see this groundswell of solidarity with Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire. And you begin to see students really take the lead. We have the encampments, but we also have the repression of those encampments. This is from the encampment in McGill in the summer of 2024. But the focus on campuses also had its limits, right? How are we building out the campaign to confront a genocide beyond campus, right? Within unions, within our workplaces, within our communities, right? And so there hadn't been an overall strategy. It was quite diffuse, right? You had, in some cities, you had some neighborhood organizing committees, but it really became decentralized in a way that's both extremely healthy, but in a way that created pitfalls in terms of what do we do after a ceasefire? What do we do to push BDS? So unlike the moment when BDS first began, where you had sort of larger coalitions or coordination and maybe more of an outlook, now the movement has become quite diffuse, right? And simply, again, much more siloed in sort of in this humanitarian way in some regards. And so, understanding that now, and this is from Arun Gupta, that the challenge for the Palestine Solidarity movement is our question of how do we build power to disrupt the U.S. support for Israel, arguably Canada as well, just as the anti-war movement did during the Vietnam War, which combined with Vietnamese resistance to defeat the American war effort. So the question is strategically, how do we distill the lessons of 40 years of Palestine solidarity so that we can actually have the strategic victories and end Canadian support for Israeli apartheid raises real questions, but there are also hopes, right? And so this is, in terms, there's a lot of lessons. This is from not a local example, unfortunately. So this is the November 28th general strike in Italy in solidarity with Gaza against the war effort, also with NATO in terms of Russia, where millions of people took to the streets, shut down schools, train stations, the whole ports, everything. And the general strike was a legitimate general strike by all the trade union federations, but the calls began by a tiny radical union, USB, that has many of its members are migrants and who are in precarious jobs. But USB is a militantly anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist union alongside COBAS, which is Mohammed Arafat, was an Egyptian migrant worker who went to Italy on the boat, on one of the death boats, was undocumented, and had organized in the warehouses, in the logistics sector, in the north of Italy, and that union, which is almost 90% all migrant workers, also was one of the first unions to make the call for the general strike in Italy. And that general strike in Italy changed the response of European states. It had supported the flotilla. I mean, and we're talking about shifting Maloney's politics, obviously it wasn't out of ideals or ideology. She was afraid of her losing political power, right? Maloney's openly a fascist, right, in Italy. So, but it was clear that the movement in Italy was able to shape Italian foreign policy. Obviously, with limits, it wasn't, the boats turned around, like, as soon as they left Italian waters, it's like, we're done supporting your little flotilla, good luck with Israel. But the fact that they had to even do that and escort the flotilla to a degree showed the power of that general strike. And so the lessons I think that we need to discern is that, because in the Palestine Solidarity movement, there's a lot of tendencies, well, we should just do what the Israeli lobby does. We should lobby power, right? If we just lobby power effectively, we can make change, right? Or simply we should just focus our energy on campuses. Or that we should simply just be talking about Palestine, really sort of become dead ends for our movement, right? If we're going to build a broad militant radical movement, it has to be grounded in our local struggles here as part of a bigger world outlook and vision, and creating a new language of struggle, but that we're really going to have any success of challenging Canadian support for Israeli apartheid, because it's fundamentally linked to an agenda. It's actually ruining our lives here, right? It's very much linked to the agenda of cuts on our campuses, to the anti-migrant xenophobia, to the austerity measures that are being fueled by this militarism, right? And very much of how this war on Iran and Lebanon is very much linked to the question of Palestine, right? And that it's really us from below that can change and shape history. It's not going to be the Putins or the Kim Jong-uns or the new Khomeini that's going to change the world, but it's actually going to be us, and it's going to be us from here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.